Ladies and gentlemen, it's like this. If a team wins 5 major titles in 7 years, it has to be a dynasty, right? The Montreal Canadiens from the 1965 campaign to 71, 65 66, in 64 65, 65 66, won 5 crowns, only stopped by the Leafs in 67 and not making the playoffs in 1970. So today we're going to talk about what they call the middle child of that Stanley Cup run, or the Beliveau dynasty, where the team had a losing record in the 67-68 season, but took first place in the East Division with a strong 26-5-6 home record. Now, the 67-68 Montreal Canadiens season was a close 59th in play. This year, they won their 15th Stanley Cup in club history. Now, the 67 expansion draft was held on June 6, 67 in the ballroom at the Quebec Elizabeth Hotel in Montreal. The Canadiens lost 18 players in the NHL expansion draft. GM Sam Pollock helped Clarence Campbell drop the rules for the draft. The most notable players lost were Charlie Hodge to the Seals, Jean-Guy Talbot, Dave Ballon, and Jim Roberts. Now, on March 3rd, 68, Jean Beliveau joined Gordie Howe as the only players to have 1,000 points. Now, Montreal ended the season with a plus 69 differential, 42, 22, and 10, only giving up 167 counters. Now, the Montreal were 5-5 against Boston, 6-2-2 against Chicago, 6-3-1 against Detroit, 4-4-2 against the Rangers, 5-3-2 against Toronto, for 26-7-17-7 against the old original six. But against the expansion West Division, which also included Detroit in the mix, couldn't have Chicago in the mix yet. They went 2-2 in the LA Kings, 2-1-1 against Minnesota, 3-1 against Oakland, 2-1-1 against Philadelphia, 4-0 against Pittsburgh, and 3-0-1 against St. Louis for a 15-5-3 record. Now, the regular season stats were quite strong for Beliveau. Even though he played in 59 games, he led the team with 68 points and 31 counters. The very underrated Bobby Russo had 65 points and led the squad with 46 assists. Yvan Cournoyer had 28 goals, Gilles Tremblay at 23, Dickie Duff 25, Ralph Backstrom, the future WHA star, at 20, Jacques Lemaire at 22, so a very balanced attack. And John Ferguson had 15 goals with only 117 minutes in the sin pit. Now on defense, J.C. Tremblay was strong, Jacques Laperriere, Ted Harris, Serge Savard, Terry Harper as well, Carol Vadnais in limited play, and of all people, Brian Watson. Now Rogie Vachon and Gump Worsley shared duties. Rogie went 23-13-2 to lead the Habs, while Gumper went 19-9-8. In the postseason, Cournoyer had 14 points. Lemaire had 7 counters, as did Beliveau. Henri Richard had 8 points in 13 contests after a marginal regular season. And again, Mickey Redmond also played that year for Montreal. Now, Worsley won 11 games in the postseason, while Rogie only started 2. Now, the road to the Stanley Cup final was paved with good intentions by the Boston Bruins. This was a Bobby Orr-led squad. But ironically, ladies and gentlemen, the Boston Bruins were no match for Montreal in a 4-game sweep. Now, in the first game at the Forum, Henri Richard on the power play scored at 14:08 to tie it after a counter by Ken Hodge, with Claude Provost scoring the winner in the third period at 14:40. Game 2 was against Montreal. Jacques Lemaire opened the lead for Montreal 1-0, with Ken Hodge tying it at 13:58 in the first. In the second, Jacques Lemaire with the second, and later Dick Duff in the third period staked him a good lead. Now Ted Green made it 3-2 after 2. In the third, Dick Duff scored his first in the postseason. Johnny McKenzie replied to make it 4-3, but Beliveau scored his first insurance goal of the series. Now back in Boston, it was all Montreal. Even though Boston scored with Ed Westphal early in the first, Jean Beliveau tied it at the end of first. In the second, Claude Provost put Montreal ahead 2-1, with Tommy Williams tying it at 2-2. But the third period was all Montreal, as Backstrom, Ferguson, and Dickie Duff scored. Now in the final game 3, Montreal had trailed 1-0 again by an early counter, Eddie Westphal, but Leroux scored in the first period at 12:58, and Claude scored in the second at 7:20 before Ken Hodge tied it. And of course, the money player Ralph Backstrom had the winner at 60-33. So this was against a Bobby Orr led squad. So now against the Chicago Blackhawks, this was a barn burner of a series because Montreal couldn't stop scoring. The first game was 9-2 for Montreal. He led 3-0 after the first and 4-0 after the second. By the time Doug Jarrett scored, it was already, I think, 7-0. And Jarrett and Marat made it 7-2. But then Backstrom, Cornway, Ferguson with his second, Cornway with his second, Ferguson again, Gilles Tremblay, Jacques Lemaire, Jean Beliveau, and Claude Larose. Now, game 2, Beliveau had the big game with the hat trick. Stan Mikita had staked him to an early 1-0 lead, but Beliveau almost had a natural hat trick as he scored 2 on a power play, and he was sandwiched by Jacques Lemaire. Now, game 3 in Chicago, Montreal led 2-0, 1-0 early. Doug Jarrett tied it. Cornway scored the second. By the way, there's a Beliveau 7 in the postseason. Cornway scored the second. Jarrett tied it again. There was Yvon Cornway and J.C. Tremblay. Now, game 4, Chicago didn't want to be swept. Bobby Hull finally woke up from his stupor, gave Chicago an early 1-0 lead. Richard tied in the second period, but Hull again on the shorthand made it 2-0, 2-1, and that was the final score. Now in the third and fifth deciding game, again a big overtime victory. Montreal led on a goal by Bobby Rousseau early, with Bobby Schmatz, that later Boston superstar against Montreal, scored at 9:59 a second. But J.C. Tremblay on the shorthand, 11:15. In the third period, Mikita scored at 1:23, but Lemaire put him ahead 3-2 again. But Wayne Mackey, probably one of the biggest goals of his career, scored at 8:14 to send it overtime. And in the first overtime period, it was Jacques Lemaire's sixth of the postseason at 2:14. Now, the way it worked out, they would have played Minnesota in the Stanley Cup Finals, but St. Louis had outlasted Minnesota in double overtime in that famous Game 7. Now, put this in perspective, ladies and gentlemen. Of all people, Dickie Moore, sixth in the postseason, sent it to the overtime, with, of all people, Ron Schock, who basically couldn't hit a side of a barn, scored in overtime. Now, when the Canadiens advanced for 4 consecutive Stanley Cup Finals, having won the title in 65 and 68, the Blues bet out the 5 other teams also playing in their inaugural season to reach the final 2. Montreal earned 7 of 8 points in this year's regular season series against St. Louis. Now, Blues coach Scotty Bowman, a future head coach of the Habs, but a longtime member of the Canadiens organization, was unable to spur the Blues in an upset, even though each game was 1 goal. The Canadiens, led by Beliveau and Richard, swept the series in 4 games. Now, what happened in the opening game? Barclay Plager staked the Blues. They had home ice advantage, by the way, to a 1-0 lead, but Richard tied it at 9:42. In the second, Dickie Moore, 7th in the postseason, in one of his best playoff series ever, scored. And then Cornway tied it up at 18:14. And of course, in overtime, another big goal by Jacques Lemaire, 7th in the postseason. A lot of people felt he should have won the Conn Smythe that year, but he didn't. Now, in their 1-0 victory in Game 2, Serge Savard, his only goal of the postseason, a shorthand, came at 2:17 of the third to stake the victory for Montreal. Now, in Game 3, back at the Forum, Yvon Cornway tied it up after Frank Saint-Marseille scored his 5th of the postseason. In the second, Savard put Montreal ahead at 1:23, but the former Montreal Canadiens scored at 3:37, Red Berenson, to send a deadlock in the third period. Backstrom scored 11:43, but then Berenson, again his 5th, on the shorthand, scored at 17:25, and the former Olympian Bobby Rousseau gave the casket to the Blues in Game 3 by scoring 1:13 of overtime. Now, get this, ladies and gentlemen. Montreal only gave up 12 shots, but Gum Worsley gave up 3 goals. Now, in the final contests, Dickie Duff, his third of the postseason, scored at 16:47. But of all people, future Washington Capitals Craig Cameron scored at 6:53 in the second. Then Gary Sabourin with a power play goal at 7:50 after Richard had put Montreal ahead. And then his only, I think, Stanley Cup winning goal, J.C. Tremblay, at 11:40, his third in the postseason. And Gumper made 19 saves on 29, the great Glenn Hall, 28 of 31. So, a very, very interesting postseason. And again, You have to call it the Belleville dynasty because that was 5 cups in 7 years, and they bet Boston 3 times, so they were the dominant team in the East Coast Division. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's the story of the 67-68 Montreal Canadiens and their unique route to the Stanley Cup Final. They had young Cornway and Lemaire, Jean Beliveau, Ferguson, some older players like Backstrom and Russo. Bobby Russo, very underrated player, and I think they gave up on him too soon for the Rangers. That's my thought. So, ladies and gentlemen, if you like what you're doing here with our Montreal Canadiens Vintage Podcast, let us know with a like, comment, subscribe, or share.